Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and today we're going to be talking about Viking books. So in this episode, I am going to be talking about the books about the Viking Age that I read in the month of April. I read these for Historathon. That is a year-long celebration, a reading event in which we are reading, discussing, and celebrating nonfiction history throughout the entire year. We have split up the year into 4 quarters, and each of those quarters looks at a certain period of history. The first quarter, we looked at prehistory up to the year around 500 CE. And then in the second quarter, which we are in right now, in which all of these books relate to, it goes from 500 to the year 1500. I decided in April to dedicate that month, really for the most part, to one of my favorite historical eras, and that would be the Viking Age. Now, of course, we use the term Viking. Hopefully we should all understand that Viking was not an ethnicity, it was a profession, and not a particularly savory one. But as a catch-all phrase, we're just going with Viking Age, as one of the books I talk about does, Anders Winroth's The Age of the Vikings. So we're just going to use Viking as something of a short catch-all phrase. More accurately, maybe we should say Scandinavians or Norse. But moving ahead, I have 2 nonfiction history books, and I also have 2 Icelandic sagas, both written around the 14th century, I believe. This one in particular, Grettir the Strong, was a fairly late written one, but these were works written after the Viking Age, but really about the Viking Age, or at least in the case of this one, Saga of King Hrolf Kraki, a period before the Viking Age proper, but still very much related to it. I'll discuss these briefly afterwards. Now, the way that I approach videos, it's unscripted. These are not like formal systematic reviews. I just talk about the things that I read and some of the thoughts that I had. And hopefully that helps people out if they also want to read it. And of course, if you've read these things, I always invite you to let me know what you thought as well. So for, again, this month of Historathon, I'm making this video a little bit late. We are now almost halfway into May, but that's generally how I do things. I get around to making these videos when I can. I will first talk about the saga, The Age of the Vikings by Anders Winroth. Then I'll talk about The Last Viking, the true story of King Harald Hardrada, by Don Hollway, and then the 2 sagas. And then at the very end, I also have, for those people who actually stick around for the end of the video, I do have a Viking Age artifact that I am going to show and share and just discuss briefly. So to start us off, the first thing that I read about the Viking Age was this one. So this is a kind of an introductory text for people, I guess, fairly new to the subject, although I wouldn't recommend this for people who know nothing about the Vikings. Winroth organizes this book thematically, which is perfectly fine if you already have a decent elementary background into that time period, but I think it can be very difficult for people to access if it's the very first thing they read. But this is not the first thing I've read. Especially last year I read Neil Price's, right? Hopefully I'm remembering his name right. Children of Ash and Elm, which I thought was excellent. That was an excellent introduction to the Viking Age. And I would consider this actually an excellent companion piece. I really did like this. It didn't necessarily always draw me in the way that Children of Ash and Elm did, but there were times where it certainly did. Winroth, he does kind of pull the reader in through the use of storytelling. He likes to kind of set the scene, which it does a great job of giving us context to some of the things he's going to be talking about in the chapters. In the very beginning, he's discussing really kind of how their society was ranked. He does quite a bit of discussion about dispelling myths about the Vikings. Those might be modern day myths that we have about what kind of people they were and exactly what Vikings were, and how they differ from representations in pop culture. It also has to deal with misrepresentations in history. People, scholars, translators who maybe mistranslated certain things and gave us false impressions. And I think he does an excellent job with that. He does a very good job explaining the economic systems, especially of the Norse world. And one of my favorite parts, really, about the book, though, is at the end, where he goes through what they call the arts and letters, where he basically talks about skaldic verse, runestone inscriptions. He talks about the poetic form, and he goes into some pretty good detail about how difficult it is to translate some of those things because of how many double meanings things can have, or how runes can, apparently kind of stand for multiple letters at times. So he gives us one of the examples from a certain runestone and how many different interpretations you can have of what it's actually trying to say. So, again, I don't know if this is the very first thing you ever read about the Vikings. You might want to start with something simpler and then build your way up to this. But otherwise, I thought this was an excellent introduction. I would probably still recommend Children of Ashen Elm first before this, but I still think that this is an excellent companion piece because it is not doing the same exact thing that Children of Ashen Elm does. It has different strengths, and it fills in some of the gaps, I think, that I didn't really remember, at least, reading in Price's book. So really glad that I read this. I really enjoyed it. And let's say there are not a lot of illustrations, but there are some things. There are some areas to be found. And of course, we have some of the color illustrations as well inside. And this is from Princeton University Press. And it was published early 2014. Okay. The other nonfiction history book I read was not quite as academic as this, but it's not what it's trying to do. So, Don Hollway wants to recount the story of King Harald Hardrada, and I did have a commenter try and explain to me exactly how that name is pronounced, and I'm sorry if I'm still butchering it. I don't always remember what people tell me as far as pronunciation goes, but we go with it. I'm not a linguistics channel, so that's one of the dangers of having a booktube channel is you read a lot of things, you don't always know how to pronounce them though, but you sally forth anyway. So, the Last Viking, aptly named, King Harald, he does mark the end of an era. Generally, his death at Stamford Bridge in 1066, I think is generally accepted among historians. That pretty much ends what we would call the Viking era. And it's a very interesting book. So, Don Hollway actually begins this book with a discussion of Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic chieftain who wrote a ton of history in the Middle Ages, including the Heimskringla, the Circle of the World, that talked about if I remember correctly, the history of the Norwegian kings, and which is some great, and actually the section on King Harald is really good. It actually has some of the old skaldic verse within there that probably date back closer to the time period, which, closer to the 1000, like 1066 in that era, than a few centuries later when Snorri was writing it. But he does that for a particular reason, because he's basically out to do what essentially Snorri did. Snorri looked at the sources and he tried to give as compelling and as accurate as possible a story as he could about these kings and also Harald. And that's kind of what Don Hollway is trying to do as well. This is not meant to be a serious academic text, although it is grounded in history. But really, he's out to tell the best story he can, given the sources. What that results in is there are times, like for instance, when Harald, before he's king, for a time he's actually working in Constantinople for the emperor and the empress as part of the Varangian Guard. And there are certainly many times, I think, where Harald could have been at a certain place at a certain time. And for dramatic effect or storytelling effect, Hollway likes to have us imagine that he was there and what it would have looked like, and maybe the faces or the reactions that Harald might have had. Now, of course, we don't have any solid historical basis for things like that, but in a narrative sense, it's plausible and it helps to move the story along. So that kind of approach, I think you can feel a lot more in the beginning of the book, although as it goes on, it starts to feel more grounded in, what we really know happened. And of course, if there's a legend, he lets you know that it's a legend and that there might not be truth to it, but he's still going to tell it. So if you want a good yarn in a lot of ways, this is a pretty good pick. There are many times too the way that he describes Harald. It reminded me a lot of Robert E. Howard, and I was reading a Conan story. He talks about and he might be pushing it a little bit too far for narrative effect, referring to Harald as like a northern barbarian and uncultured, and he's in Constantinople. It sounds a lot like Conan going through the southern cities and not knowing how to react, and that stuff might be a little bit overblown, overstretched. Refer to him as a northern barbarian. I'm not entirely sure that sometimes it fits where he's putting it. You could make it work, but it's definitely there more for a storytelling effect. So if you like Conan stories, I think you'll get a vibe here, at least in Harald's early career. But just like Conan, Harald does become king, in some ways kind of by his own hand. Now, that's the other thing about this. Harald is not really a likable person. Hardrada, he wasn't called that to his face, certainly. But it basically means hard ruler. And he was kind of a jerk. In the beginning, you're kind of rooting for him a little bit when he's young, but especially by the time he's a king, you kind of sense that he's the villain in his own story. Maybe, I don't know if anti-hero is really the right word, because I think as far as anti-heroes go, they still kind of do the right thing in the end. I wouldn't say that that's what Harald Hardrada does. He's quite ruthless to his own people. He is not very trustworthy. There are many people who he gives his word to that he reneges on it. So when he falls, there's almost a sense of relief in the leader that King Harold Godwinson of England is pretty much able to take him down in the end. So you don't necessarily mourn the loss of King Harold, and you're not supposed to, right? I mean, he is the last Viking. As I was saying earlier in the video, Viking is not an ethnicity. Viking was, a raider, a pirate. They were fairly despicable people. And I'm not talking about the Norse. I'm talking about specifically a Viking, right? Somebody who commits some tremendous amounts of violence towards grabbing wealth from others and enslaving people. And that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. So yeah, I'm glad I read it. It was fun. I had a great time with it. Just know that if you want to read it, that it's not serious academia. It is historical. So I don't think you have to worry about Hollway's interpretations in a lot of ways. I think you're still going to get some solid history out of this, but you're kind of going in there to hear a good story, not necessarily to, quote for some academic paper. And that's a good segue to the first saga that I read. April is also, that fits in nicely with Historathon, is also a booktube event called Saga Long, where there are some great co-hosts, but they choose a saga, or in this case, two sagas. You can do one or the other, or both. I chose to do both, to spotlight and read in April. Now, I love these sagas. As I had mentioned earlier, they are written in a later Christian era, but they are writing about centuries before. Sometimes in a Christian time, sometimes in a pagan time, and sometimes that comes off more awkwardly than others. We definitely get some awkwardness in this one with that. Essentially reading about that time period and their religion, their beliefs through a Christian filter. But this I think, is a good segue from the Last Viking, Hardrada, because we have the saga of Grettir the Strong, and Grettir is also not a very likable person. He is something more like an anti-hero. He's a jerk. Most of the time, you're not going to like him. You're not going to agree with what he does. But occasionally, he does do the right thing, and he does help people. Essentially, he had the, I don't know if it's the fame or the infamy of being what I believe is like the longest outlaw in Iceland. That was uncaught or not killed. So he spent a lot of time outside the law. And Grettir is known for being incredibly strong, but he's also impulsive. He's not easy to be around. He's butchers animals for no reason, starts fights with a lot of people. Although there is some growth. You have to give these sagas credit. They're not one-dimensional characters. We do actually start seeing some character growth in a lot of these people. And Grettir, we start seeing some of that basically jumping towards violence, getting pulled back some. He's never really exactly likable, but you don't have to worry about his actions quite as much as the story goes on. And what's also fascinating about this is that it is a very late saga. It was written very late, and many other sagas were obviously known to this person. They were probably written. So Grettir kind of comes into contact with people they're like cameos from other sagas. So, before you had the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you kind of have the Saga universe. You're seeing these people who are being written about kind of popping in and bumping into each other throughout these, which is kind of cool. It's neat to kind of that cross literary style. And not only that, we see a lot of influence from the continent, from the more romantic, more chivalric, I guess you could say, writing of the Middle Ages. I had read a lot of that stuff as an undergrad, but it's been like 20 years since I read a lot of that stuff, so it's not fresh in my mind, although I was getting a vibe from some of it. But of course, both these editions have excellent introductions that explain quite a bit, and I could sense it as the introduction had said I would. But essentially, we go from kind of a more straightforward, punchy, sparse writing style of the sagas to something that's more fluid, and we get like before the end. This isn't. I'm trying to stay mostly out of spoilers, but Grettir doesn't last the entire novel, and at the end we have like a romantic farce of like a woman who's cheating on her husband, and the other guy is hiding, and it gets a little bit bizarre given what we got before. But we essentially see Grettir progress. We see the novel change over time. The person who wrote this obviously knew a lot about the contemporary literature of his day, and he seems to be imitating it along the way, and imitating it pretty well. But I really like this. It's also a story with a lot of great supernatural elements. Most of these sagas, like this at least, are grounded in reality, but there are amazing supernatural elements. We get basically some revenants, I guess they're Droiger, or ghosts. Awesome, like there's a cinematic quality when Grettir confronts this ghost that's haunting this farm and murdering people at night. It's just an awesome scene. So there are great things like that I really, really enjoyed. So I'm glad I read this. I thought it was terrific. And then I read this, which is far shorter. This is a different type of saga. This is not grounded in reality. King Hrolf, he might have existed. He probably existed at one point, but hardly anything in here really is historical. This is more legendary. So this takes place in a time before the Viking Age. And it's more like a fantasy novel. We see kind of Rolf's ancestors and what they go through, and it's a little bit disjointed in a way. Unlike Grettir, Grettir has more of a smoother narrative. This one seems to kind of have large leaps and bounds, and you're not always entirely sure where it's going, but when it hits, it hits. Like I said, it's far more of a fantasy element, a lot more legendary qualities. We get a werebear in here, we get an undead army, we get spells being cast. There is really cool stuff in here. There's like a woman who's, I think, like half elf. So we can see where so much inspiration for people like J.R.R. Tolkien came from, because he of course knew these things, right? This is where he got a lot of his inspiration from. So really quick read, a lot of fun, and this is where we see a lot more the intrusion into Christianity. You get the sense sometimes from reading these that you have Christians writing about a pagan time, and you get the sense that they love reading and writing about this stuff and hearing about it, but there's a sense of guilt over it because it's not Christian. So they have to somehow justify it. And it's not strong in this necessarily, but you see it in this. And there's these weird kind of Christian intrusions where they insist that, Hrolf never never really depended on the gods, only on his own might, and basically trying to, claim that these guys weren't pagans in a pagan time. And Odin is seen as like this almost like satanic figure, at least the way that he's referred to sometimes. And Odin certainly would have been. He was feared in a lot of ways. I mean, he was the god of the hanged. He was a war god, but he wasn't like this. Like a demonic figure, almost like they make him out in this sometimes. So there's a mix though, because sometimes Odin actually seems like he's wise and he's instructing them, but when they have to talk about Odin, they have to do it disparagingly because we have this Christian filter going on. So it's interesting. You have to expect things to not make sense. There's one episode in here where a man bites off a woman's nose, and the context for that seems to be completely lost. We really don't know why he does this. It seems to come out of nowhere, but obviously there's something missing from this story that would explain why he would do something like that. So it's very odd. These are two very different experiences, but very rewarding in their own ways. This is definitely a superior work, but this just has such weird stuff in it that I still enjoyed it. So those are the books about the Viking Age that I read in April for Historathon. I said I would show one Viking Age artifact. So let's do that now. I've got this. Hopefully the camera's picking that up okay. When I got my master's degree in history, I kind of treated myself a little bit, and I had gotten this from an antiquities dealer. And yes, I have a certificate of authenticity. It's packed away somewhere from the move still, but it is real. It is legit. But they called this a Viking pouch knife, and it was dug up in England. And it probably dates from the 900s. And a Viking pouch knife, it basically has a whittle tang, so there would have been a wooden tang encasing. Wooden handle encasing this, or it could have also been antler or bone. And from it's hard to find information on these things that aren't just rehashing the same old description from the antiquities dealers. But the impression I got is that they might have actually hanged these little things. It's small. I mean, this is not that big. Think of it more like somebody carrying around a Swiss Army pocket knife. But it might have even hung from a string from their neck. It was like an everyday sort of utility knife, and it could have been used for killing, but also for other day-to-day things as well. This was not necessarily as prized as like a sax or scram sax, the kind of things that they might have been buried with. But for day-to-day use, this is just the kind of thing that they would have. So this thing is, it's over 1,000 years old. I'm also an historical edged weapons enthusiast, I would say. I'm too poor to call myself a collector at this point, but that's why I, was holding a Viking sword up. This was actually given to me by a friend who moved away and couldn't really keep packing all of his swords away, so he was kind enough to give that one to me. I got another one packed away downstairs somewhere. But yeah, I just thought, people, if they made it this far in the video, they might be interested in seeing that. I have this hanging on my wall in my library. And that's it. That was a rundown of the Viking Age or Viking era books that I read for Historathon in the month of April. So that was The Last Viking by Don Hollway, The Age of the Vikings by Anders Winroth, and you got the Saga of Grettir the Strong and the Saga of Hrolf Kraki. If you've read any of these, as usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, thank you, BookTube.